There are presidents you can summarize with a list. Andrew Jackson is not one of them. Jackson is a storm system, personal trauma, frontier violence, political revolution, and policies that caused generational harm.
His supporters saw a champion of the common man fighting the national bank, stopping the nullification crisis, ending property requirements to vote. His critics then and now see something else, a president who expanded democracy for some while enforcing slavery and dispossession, and who treated opponents like enemies in a personal war.
And if you're new to Jackson, here's the easiest warning label. If you like calm leadership and nonviolent conflict resolution, this will not be your guy.
In this episode, we'll do Jackson in full background: rise, family, and inner circle, enemies. Then three big set pieces: the Dickinson duel, the corrupt bargain, and the Bank War. And we'll confront the center of gravity in his legacy, his worldview about Native Americans, and the machinery of removal. So let's get going with this. We do want to welcome you to Things You Don't Know, where we don't just ask what happened, we ask what it meant. And with me is Dr. Sean Deneen and Chandler Foster.
One of the things we're going to do tonight, Dr. Weaver, is speak to the listeners who just know the main Andrew Jackson mostly as a vibe, intense, angry, and somehow always holding a grudge.
That's certainly true. He's born in 1767 in the Waxhaws area on the Carolina frontier. It's not a settled world. It's a region shaped by land conflict and weak institutions where reputation and force often substitute for the courts and stability.
His early life is dominated by loss. His father dies before he is born. As a teenager during the Revolutionary War, Jackson is captured by the British. There's an episode where he refuses an officer's order and is slashed, leaving scars. Soon after, his mother dies as well.
So, Dr. Weaver, what you're saying here is that violence, grief, and a deep belief that the world is hostile and that you don't back down. You're saying that this is kind of his starter kit?
Yes, I am. And it is a truly tragic start.
It leads to all sorts of unfortunate events in the future.
Mm-hmm.
You're quite correct, Chandler. He studies law, then goes west to Tennessee, which is still a frontier. He becomes a lawyer, a state politician, a judge, and a militia leader, as well as a planter. He's ambitious, quick to take offense. He fights 37 duels over the years, and extremely loyal to friends, as long as they stay loyal back.
And he adopts the frontier honor culture model. Insults aren't just rude, they're threats. And threats demand a response. Let's look at his home life and the Hermitage. Rachel Donaldson Jackson is central to his private life. Their marriage becomes a political target later, in part because divorce laws and timing in that era created confusion and a vulnerability for scandal.
They do not have biological children, but they adopt. His nephew Andrew Jackson Jr. being the most prominent, and ironically, because of his future, a Native American young man who dies, unfortunately. Their household includes extended family and dependents. It's important to remember Rachel Jackson is in many ways his moral anchor. It's very similar to Theodora and Justinian. Look at that podcast if you get a chance. She's able to sometimes calm him down in moments of great rage and encourage him to at least try to think before going off half-cocked. Not that that happened very often, but once she isn't around, look out.
That's exactly right, Dr. Janine. And also, enslaved people lived in their house as well. We can't forget about that. See, we can't talk about the Hermitage as home without recognizing the fact that it was also a plantation.
Right. Jackson is a slaveholder, and he defends slavery as part of his world view. His world view. His wealth and status are tied to it. When we say common man politics in this era, it's often democracy expanding for white men while slavery and racial hierarchy remain and in some ways intensify.
To understand Jackson, you have to understand dueling culture. Remember, I said before he fought 37 of them. Dueling isn't just hot-headedness. It's a social system where public reputation is treated like survival, and it is dishonorable to let an insult go unavenged, especially among men of status. Jackson participates in that system throughout his life.
The most famous duel, arguably, is with Charles Dickinson in 1806. It begins as an argument that escalates reputation, accusations, insults, and once it goes public, backing down is treated as weakness.
So, because someone said something, they scheduled a murder appointment at a measured distance. Frontier problem solving.
Yeah, that is the way they solve things, isn't it?
On the frontier, yes, it was.
Dickinson is known as an excellent shot. Jackson's very well aware of that, but he's had the nerve to insult his wife, Rachel. I have to explain that very briefly. Rachel was married to an abusive man who almost killed her. Jackson rescued her before they became romantically involved, but they got married before the paperwork had been filed on her divorce. They didn't know that. So people accused her of being a slut and Jackson of being a bigamist, and he wasn't going to tolerate that.
Well, here's the key point. Jackson reportedly chooses an almost unbelievable strategy. He plans to let Dickinson fire first, absorb the shot, and then take careful aim for a killing shot.
Now, Dr. Weaver, I'd have to say that that's either courage or a very clinically alarming commitment to winning.
Jackson has an idea, an almost fatal idea in his own destiny. The two men meet, Dickinson fires, Jackson is hit in the chest, close enough that the bullet remains lodged near his heart for the rest of his life. Jackson steadies himself and returns fire, killing Dickinson.
The duel becomes part of the myth. Jackson as a man who will not yield, who will take a wound and still finish the fight.
And it also tells us something about his presidency. This isn't a man who de escalates, this is a man who does quite the opposite. He escalates and calls it a principle.
And he carries those wounds physically and psychologically forward. That bullet isn't just a detail or a source of physical pain. It becomes a symbol of his I survive, I endure, I punish identity that he brings into politics. Now, Jackson's fame exploded with his victory at the Battle of New Orleans in January 1815. Check out our 1812 podcast about that. The document treaty ending the war had already been signed, but the news hadn't reached the battlefield. Politically, it doesn't matter. Jackson becomes a national hero.
And there's a popular song. In 1814, we took a little trip along with Colonel Jackson down the mighty Mississippi, etc. Okay, that lasted quite a while. The victory turns him into a symbol of American toughness. That symbolism becomes political power.
So basically, he becomes famous the way action movie characters become famous by winning a dramatic fight that makes people feel safe and secure.
That's very accurate, Chandler, but we also have to hold to the full context. Jackson's military and political career is deeply and directly tied to U.S. expansion into Native American lands in the South and the West. That expansion isn't an accidental backdrop, it's a central engine of his rise.
Yes, Jackson runs for president in 1824. He wins the most popular votes and the most electoral votes, but not a majority.
So, as the Constitution provides, the elections goes to the House of Representatives. There are four candidates, and Henry Clay, a very powerful figure and one of Jackson's main rivals, supports John Quincy Adams. Adams becomes president, and then he appoints Clay as Secretary of State.
Absolutely, Dr. Deneen. And I like this kind of deal right here because this looks to Jackson's supporters like a straight trade. You make me president, and I'll make you the next big thing. Sort of like a I'll scratch your back if you'll scratch mine type deal.
Yeah, Jackson and his movement label it a corrupt bargain. Whether every piece is provable is less important than the political impact. Millions of Americans believe the elite stole the presidency.
This sounds very familiar, and this is where Jackson becomes more than a candidate. He challenges the Chief Justice of the United States to a duel. He becomes a vehicle for all resentment against institutions, against insider governance, against the idea that the people's choice can be overridden by political procedure.
So Jackson tries to turn the loss into a story. He tries to make it about himself and make it to where he's the hero. Oh, they cheated you. I'm your revenge. I'm your hero.
And in 1828, he wins.
That campaign is famously brutal. Attacks on Jackson's wife, Rachel, become particularly vicious after the election, but before Jackson's inaugurated, Rachel dies. Jackson's grief is inconsolable. He blames the stress and slander for killing her, and he carries that grief as a permanent anger. His last moral anchor is gone.
So the presidency begins with victory, mourning, and a grudge that never leaves the room.
Jackson reshapes the presidency. He uses the veto more aggressively than most of his predecessors. He treats himself as the direct representative of the people, and he treats opposition as obstruction by elites.
He builds a political machine with strong party discipline. That becomes the Democratic Party and its system in recognizable form.
Yes, and he also brings in the spoil system logic, rotation in office, rewarding loyalists, and clearing out opponents.
Mm-hmm. You know, supporters say it breaks the entrenched aristocracy. Critics say it builds corruption and patronage. Both of those can be true, but in this sense here, it does seem that this spoils system has carried forward in some very unfortunate forms, even to today. If you're loyal to the guy in power and he's got enough money or prestige, yeah, you be loyal and then you get paid back.
But on the same token, if you're not loyal, you just get done away with. There's no use for you.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You both have some a point there. Now, here's the crisis of Jackson's first term, the war on the national bank. The Second Bank of the United States, which controls most of the credit a century before the Federal Reserve, becomes a central antagonist in Jackson's presidency. Jackson sees the bank as a privileged institution, too powerful, too well connected, and too able to influence policies and destroy the economy.
Nicholas Biddle, the bank's president, believes the bank stabilizes the economy. Jackson believes it concentrates power and threatens liberty, which is interesting considering that that's what he was doing, concentrating power and, yeah, through the spoil system, threatening liberty too.
Yeah, so it's quite contradictory. So it's a philosophical duel, but with money instead of pistols.
Henry Clay pushes an early recharter of the bank, partly to force Jackson into a political corner. If Jackson signs and agrees, he disappoints his base. If he vetoes, he risks an economic backlash since 80% of the gold reserve in the country at that time, there's no paper money, are in this one bank.
Jackson vetoes, and he doesn't veto quietly. He frames it as a moral stand against special privilege, against monopoly, against a financial elite.
Yes, it's like he didn't just hit no. He hit no and then kicked over the table just to prove a point.
Then he removes all federal deposits from the bank and shifts them to selected state banks, often called his pet banks by critics. Biddle responds by tightening credit. The economy feels it. The conflict becomes a national stress test.
Jackson is censured by the Senate at one point, an extraordinary public condemnation. His opponents brand him King Andrew, accusing him of behaving like a monarch.
And how did he respond to this? Well, in the way you would expect, by acting more, well, like himself, more like Andrew Jackson.
The aftermath is very complicated. Jackson wins politically, the bank loses its federal role, but the financial system becomes even more volatile. Jackson later issues the Specie Circular that requires payment for public lands in gold and silver, not bills of exchange, which is an early form of a check. That interacts with speculation in land and access to credit. Economic turbulence grows, and the first major depression, the so called Panic of 1837, hits shortly after Jackson leaves office under his protege, Martin Van Buren.
So the Bank War is both a political triumph and part of our longer economic story with consequences. Historians argue about how directly Jackson is responsible, but no one doubts it's one of the most consequential fights between a president and the financial system. We again see vestigial roots of this flying around today. Now, we need to address the most morally defining part of Jackson's legacy for many people, his attitudes towards Native Americans as well as enslaved people, and his role in the removal and displacement of Native Americans, which to me is a very big deal.
It is, and there's no sugarcoating this. Jackson's worldview is shaped by conquest era assumptions that the United States is destined to expand, that native nations are obstacles to that expansion, that white people have superior intellect, and this type of security and progress requires control of the land.
Well, and exactly, Dr. Deneen. And when people ask the question, what did he dislike Native Americans? It's not just a personality question, it's a policy question because his administration acts as though native sovereignty is negotiable, removable, and ultimately disposable, which I think is a damn shame.
Well, exactly. Jackson's rhetoric and actions reflect the belief that native nations should not remain as independent people within states like Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and Tennessee in particular, but others too, other states, Virginia, and other places, especially as white settlers and state governments demand land for cotton cultivation and, in Georgia's case, gold rush pressures.
In 1830, Congress passed the Indian Removal Act during Jackson's presidency. The act authorizes the government to negotiate treaties exchanging native lands in the East for land west of the Mississippi.
And negotiation is doing a lot of work here because when one side has the army and the other side has homes and families, that's not a normal bargain.
The machinery is coercive, pressure campaigns, contested treaties, splitting communities, and state level harassment and violence. Jackson's administration supports the general direction and uses federal power to enable it.
Different nations face removal pressures in different ways. The Choctaw, the Creek, the Chickasaw, the Seminole, and the Cherokee. Some removals happen under Jackson, others accelerate in the years immediately after. The worst removal, the Cherokee Trail of Tears, most famously happens in 1838 after Jackson's out of office, but it follows pathways opened by Jackson's policies and political choices. I want to be very clear here. There's no justification for Native American removal, but there was an initial allotment of payment offered to some groups. $5 million was allocated for that. That was a settlement of $300 per person at a time when the average middle class income in the United States was $120 a year. A small number of Seminoles who agreed to live by civilized, meaning white standards, no polygamous marriages, no collective ownership of land, becoming Christianized, were allowed to stay in Georgia. See Jeff Paul Finn's book, Not Entirely Stolen, for details about that.
So even if the worst march happens after him, the track is already laid.
There's also the legal dimension. The Supreme Court hears cases about native sovereignty and state intrusion. A key reality of this era is that federal enforcement is inconsistent. Native nations can win arguments on paper and still lose the ground because what was happening here is quite similar to what we have going on now. If you've got the army or ICE and you've got other manipulative tools, then you can do whatever the hell you want to do, and they can't stop you because they don't have the guns you do. Isn't that sweet? Isn't that wonderful fucking democracy? Love it.
And that gap between legal principle and political enforcement is where removal becomes real. Jackson rejects a decision of the Supreme Court, making the famous statement, Justice Marshall has made his decision, let him enforce it. Jackson's posture is aligned with state and settler demands, not with protecting native sovereignty.
Which translates to the rule of law mattered less than the hunger for land.
Or the power that you have in your frickin' guns. Love it.
Yeah, because I bet you if you didn't have those guns, you wouldn't even dare to try to cross some of these people.
That is correct.
Without your guns, you're a weak coward.
Yippers. And you know, the beauty of it all is that this pattern just continues on, just continues on. It's really so wonderful. Now, we should be very explicit about outcomes: dispossession, death, broken treaties, destroyed communities, and long term trauma. We call these people, these Native Americans, savages. Were they the ones doing this stuff? No. Removal is not a policy footnote. It's a defining event in American history, and Jackson's presidency is a major turning point in making it national policy with federal backing, army backing, guns, bam, bam, bam.
And we also should be honest about the moral framing Jackson and many of his contemporaries used. A mix of paternalistic civilization talk and blunt force, as you say, Dr. Weaver. It's not neutral. It's an ideology, one that treats Native peoples as impediments to be moved.
And that's why Jackson's legacy is not just controversial, it goes way deeper than that. It's a conflict between political mythology and human consequence, which I have to say, Dr. Weaver, I wish that more humans would have more consequences for their actions in this day and age. Wouldn't that be nice?
But you mean you have a problem with not just the Native Americans being displaced, but if you will recall, after the War of 1812, who else got displaced? Black Americans.
African Americans.
Yes,
Oh, I have a major problem with all of that.
can't imagine why.
Anyone who doesn't is either mentally ill or seriously in the wrong. Jackson's inner circle includes Martin Van Buren, his key political ally and successor. He also relies on informal advisors, what are called the kitchen cabinet, sometimes operating outside of official channels.
He has some pretty famous rivals: Henry Clay, John Quincy Adams, and later John C. Calhoun, who becomes a primary antagonist during the nullification crisis. Jackson's relationships are often defined by not competence, not anything else other than loyalty to him. Sounds so familiar.
So the Jackson rule is if you're with me, I'll protect you. If you're not, I will remember your name. And I have to tell you, that is so scary of how it just ties into everything that's going on today.
So, what are we supposed to do with him? Jackson strengthens the presidency, I guess, in a sense, and changes American politics. He also advances policies that create immense harm. Immense harm. Just read about the Trail of Tears, which I think we're going to do a podcast on. People need to know about that because it seems to have been washed away and forgotten. Anyhow, he does advance policies that create immense harm, especially removal. And he anchors his worldview in slavery and expansion. In other words, stealing native lands.
He's a case study in the contradictions of American democracy. Wider participation for some white men, intensified oppression for others, and a presidency built on both popular energy and ruthless force.
So if someone says, "Oh, Jackson is great," the next question is, "Great for whom?" And if someone says, "Jackson is terrible," then the next question is, what parts of the system made him possible, rewarded him, and enabled him?
History isn't just heroes and villains, but consequences are real, and moral clarity matters. Jackson is a reminder that popularity and righteousness and bully tactics are not the same.
Certainly not. If you want a closing thought, Jackson is what happens when personal honor culture, ego, frontier expansion, and mass politics fuse into expanded presidential power.
That's right. And when the president treats policy like a duel, the whole country ends up standing at the measured distance.
Listen, thanks for listening. I hope that perhaps you enjoyed some of this. And hey, I'm sure that I ticked off some people. And hey, you know what?
I hope we did, Dr. Weaver.
Well, I was just going to say, if you ticked off, come on, shoot me a text or whatever. I'll communicate with you. I'll talk with you in person. Yes, I will. No
Me too. I don't
problem.
mind to do that either, Dr. Weaver.
So we do want you to like and subscribe, and we do want you to come back for more history that explains itself and also complicates itself.
That's exactly right. And we will see you next time.
So long, folks.